All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Glad to see you all. I'm glad you all are able to come back. I have to say, so this class is a class in history and archaeology, but we need to stop and talk about miracles for a minute, because last Monday night, I witnessed a miracle. I was sitting at a restaurant, a sports bar in Waco, Texas, and there on the screen, the Jaguars beat the Kansas City Chiefs. And it was like, oh my God, miracles do occur. There was clearly divine intervention going on there. We're just talking about the Jaguars. Good morning. So you never know. I had to look out the window and make sure that the earth was still spinning on its axis, because it's just all crazy. So welcome back. Just a quick introduction. If you weren't here last week, I'm Scott Burch, and I'll be kind of facilitating the class. We are filming the class, and I worked out all the details with Caleb this past week. So Monday, hopefully, last week's class will be posted to the church's YouTube site, and then I'm going to have this video to him Monday morning as well. So hopefully it'll all be there, and as soon as I get where it's posted, I'll send you all a link. And then if you're out of town, or you're just really bored during the week and you have nothing, or you can't sleep, you could turn it on and watch me talk again put you right out. So I'll send you out the link as soon as I get that. So this week, I figured we'll just jump right into it. I was telling Pam that, this class today is the trifecta, because we have timelines, maps, and pictures of old stuff. So I mean, it's like this is what the whole class is about. So it's awesome. So before we started, I just wanted to get everybody situated. I'm sure you all know this, but there's some terminology that we need to talk about and just where we are. So this is from Google Earth, so a recent photograph, satellite imagery, and we call it the Middle East. Most biblical scholars who deal with ancient societies call it the ancient Near East. Because if you were living in Greece, this was or Rome, this was the Near East, and then China was the Far East. So anciently, those were the terminologies. Today, we call it East and Middle East. So when I say the ancient Near East, or if you see an abbreviation that says A&E, that's what we're talking about. This is the area. And there are a bunch of, good morning. There's a couple of things to notice. One is, most of this area is desert, right? This is the Arabian Desert, Saudi Arabia. But there's this little ring, good morning. There's this little ring here from starting in Iraq. So here's Iraq, Basra, Baghdad, and the Tigris and Euphrates River flow down through Iraq. And you notice it's kind of green in here, and there's green through here, and it arcs up through here. This is Turkey, down through Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and then here is Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria. And this little green arc is known as the Fertile Crescent. So this is the current map with all the current countries. This is the ancient map. This is where all the ancient stuff is. And so I think of it as like an age of empires back then. You had the Egyptian Empire that was really strong and through many phases of ancient history. The reason it was really strong is they had the Nile River, and the Nile River was independent of what was happening in the Mediterranean, because the headwaters of the Nile River are further down in Egypt, and it flows north up into the sea. So they always had water. They had a lot of fertile. So we think of Egypt as dry and dusty and pyramids, but there's a lot of agriculture and a lot of stuff that goes on through there. There was the Hittite Empire up here in what's now Turkey. There was the Assyrian Empire that's kind of in this northeast area here. The Babylonians were down in what's today Iraq. And then the Persians were over here in what's now Iran. And at different times in ancient history, these different empires would grow in strength. They'd take over for a while. They were what I would call the superpowers of the day. They kind of had control of everything. And Israel was just this little strip right here. They were a player or a power, regional power. They weren't just nobody, but compared to the Egyptians or the Hittites or the Babylonians or the Assyrians, they were a minor player in that political realm. The reason that Israel is so important, though, is if you're in Egypt and you're trading with the East, you can't go across the desert back then. If y'all remember seeing, Lawrence of Arabia with Peter O'Toole, and he's like going across. People didn't go across the desert back then. It was not capable of doing that. We can do that today with technology and vehicles and air conditioning and all that. But back then, you couldn't do that. So you had to go up and around. So everybody's going up and around. And what's right in the pathway of up and around is Canaan, Palestine, Israel, all right here. They were the crossroads. Everybody was going through. If Assyria wanted to attack Egypt, they had to go through Israel. And they would warm up on Israel on their way down to make sure their soldiers were ready. If Egypt wanted to trade with Babylon, they had to go up and around. So everybody's kind of going through. So part of why the Bible is a thing is because it was at the crossroads of all this ancient trading military route where everybody had to go through. We don't ever hear much about whatever happened over here. A little desert, I'm sure there was some little desert village down here by the Persian Gulf that nobody ever went to. It's just not part of the thing, but all the movement was through there. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background to orient you as we think about these things and we start to go through the archaeology. All right, so I wanted to start at the beginning, but then I was like, where's the beginning? What's the right beginning to start at? And if we're talking about the Bible, it's not Genesis 1:1. That's the beginning of the story that's in the Bible. But what would you say is the most significant event? Hey, Cora, good morning. What's the most significant event in Israelite history? So think about the Old Testament. What would you say? The Exodus, big event, but I would argue it's not the most significant. Abraham. Abraham is a huge event, not the most significant, in my humble opinion. Any other thoughts? Adam. Creation, important. But when it comes to the writing of the Bible, not very. The Babylonian exile, yes. This is the extent of my great PowerPoint skills, is to make the little red devil face. In the 8th and 7th and 8th century BCE, before the Common Era, the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, was overrun by the Assyrians, dispersed into antiquity, and never heard from again. You've all heard about the 12 tribes, or the 11 tribes of Israel, or 10 tribes of Israel, never heard again, the missing tribes. About 100 or so years later, the Babylonians came in and did the same thing to the Judeans, the southern kingdom of Israel. But we did hear from them again. And I would argue that when you look at the Bible narrative, all of it is informed and predicated on that horrific experience of having your country obliterated, being hauled off into exile, never knowing whether you're going to be there again, be back again, only to maybe 100 years later be back in the land with some form of self-rule and self-government, your culture, your religion still intact. Those kinds of things didn't happen in the ancient world very often. And when you think about the Abraham story, we mentioned Abraham. Where did Abraham come from? He came from the city of Ur.
Turkey.
Ur is actually down in Babylon. So they started in Babylon and come back up, very similar to the path the exiles may have taken when they came back. Where was the Garden of Eden? At the area where the Tigris and the Euphrates come together in Babylon. There's a lot of Babylonian imagery all through the Old Testament.
Is Abraham Jewish?
Yes and no. He was kind of the beginnings. He started out not from Israel. He was born in, or the story is he was born in the land of Babylon before it was really Babylon. He came up and God came to him and made a covenant with him. So he became the father of the Jewish people. But he was never given any of the Jewish laws. He was never given any of the Jewish practices. He just kind of was like, God said, follow me and do what I tell you and things will go well for you. So, interesting, yeah. I mean, we think of them all as Jewish, but technically, I don't know if Abraham, you could call him Jewish in the sense that we know today. Okay, so I don't expect you all to remember this, but this is a 500-year period from basically 1000 BCE to 500 BCE. And in this period of time, this is the time of the monarchy, the Israelite monarchy. So according to the biblical story, Saul was the first king of Egypt, or king of Israel, anointed by Samuel. Then God became displeased with Saul. David was brought in as the king. We're going to look at all of that story in depth because I think sometimes there's more there than what we typically think. And then Solomon became the king. And then after Solomon, in the biblical narrative at least, the kingdom split. The northern kingdom went off and did their thing. The southern kingdom did their thing. So you ended up with northern kings, Jeroboam, Omri, these other kings of what we call Israel. And then down here you had the kings of Judah, the Judahite kings. And they kind of did their own thing. So that split was around 900. So for about 200 years or so, there were these two kingdoms. Sometimes they were allies. Sometimes they fought with each other. They kind of had this weird, loose relationship. And then we're going to talk about today a lot. In 732 to 722, the Assyrians came in, obliterated the northern kingdom. They became gone, lost to history. And then in 587, the Babylonians came in and did the same thing to the kingdom of Judah. So this is it's a key event. And since we're talking about archaeology, this is one of the areas of the Bible where there's a lot of archaeological evidence that lines up very well with the biblical text. And for those people, I'm sure you see them on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook or wherever, who say, oh, the Bible's just a work of fiction, it didn't really happen. I think it really happened. These things kind of indicate that there's good correlation between what the pagan sources say and what the biblical sources say. But as we'll see, while there's agreement, there's also some differences of opinion as to why things happened. And so we'll get in the Bible a certain spin on things, and we'll get from the pagan sources another spin on things. Most people in this time frame weren't really interested in being kind of the unbiased journalist. They all had an agenda. And they were writing, and they didn't deny history, but they were writing to make a point. We'll see some of that here in a few minutes. Okay, so let's talk quickly about the Assyrians. They were a kingdom. They've been around since the city of Ashur was founded in 1900 BCE. So they were there for nearly 2,000 years before they were taken out and obliterated. They steadily grew to be kind of a major economy within the ancient Near East. They weren't always like this giant superpower. Kingdoms would rise, kingdoms would fall, different people would come in and out of power. But they were a major economic source. So for trade, And at the time of when the Israelite monarchy was founded, back here, 1000 BCE, Assyria was kind of approaching the zenith of their power. They were pretty well established as a strong superpower, and they continued to grow in strength as they went into these, the 10th and the 8th centuries. Yeah, 10th and 9th. Yes?
Syria is north of Babylon?
Syria is north of Babylon. Okay. So if we go back here,
okay.
Assyria and this is kind of, this area is kind of like Syria, Iraq, northern Iraq, Turkey, southeast Turkey, kind of where the Kurds are, remember, you hear about the Kurdish. It's kind of this upper northeast, and Babylon was more down here, and then Persians were down over here. So just to kind of, oh, yeah, oh, Persians down here, but I'm putting this little map. There's like a little inset. So here in Iran, yeah, you're right. Persians are down here, which is kind of where Iran and Tehran are. Babylon is here, which is right here in the heart of Iraq, where Baghdad and all the places we've heard of. Assyria is up here, which is kind of this Kurdish area, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, over down here. Assyria should not be confused with the modern state of Syria. There's not a strong connection between the two. They were just an ancient empire that kind of populated that area. Okay, so, and as you can see in this map, here's Ashur. Remember, here's the kind of our fertile crescent where everybody is. Babylonian Empire down here. The city of Ashur, which is the main city of the Assyrians, is here. And their empire was starting to spread. They had spread up through this area, and they were kind of working their way around the Fertile Crescent, becoming a major economic and military power. So for us, we're really going to focus on what's sometimes called the Neo-Assyrian Empire. When you have an empire that lasts 2,000-3,000 years, there's different phases. We're focused on the last phase, which is kind of the Neo-Assyrians or the New Syrian Empire. And they kind of were developing in the 8th century. And there's 4 names here that you need to be familiar with because they show up all the time in the Old Testament, in the Bible, in the book of 2 Kings. One was Tiglath-Pileser III. He was the emperor in the kind of the mid part of the 8th century. He was followed by Shalmaneser. The linguistic test is at the end. Followed by Sargon. We hear a lot in the Old Testament. Shalmaneser was only there for about 5 years. Sargon came in after him, and then ultimately Sennacherib, Sargon's son, became the king. So these are just names you're going to hear, and just remember as you hear them, they're referring to the kings of Assyria, but at different times. So, and I would say that and just so you know, this is a relief that's in the British Museum, found in the Assyrian area. This is Shalmaneser, or Sargon. This is Sargon over here, and this is Sennacherib over here, just for interest. So if you're in London and you go to the British Museum, you can see this stuff. There's a lot of stuff in the British Museum because the British were doing a lot of the archaeological, in the early days of archaeology in the Middle East, when their empire stretched across the world, and they would unearth all these amazing things and then cart them all back to London. So let's talk about an interesting note. This is in 852, and this was commissioned. This is a stele. A stele is one of these big rock tablets or standing stones that the ancients would do, and they would carve. And you can see it's written, there's cuneiform text all over the carving. So not only does it depict scenes of their great kings, but it tells the story of what the kings did. And this one is really interesting. It was unearthed by a British explorer named Kirk, so it's called the Kirk Stele, and it describes a battle that occurred where the Assyrians went out and fought against the 12 kings. There was kind of a group of kings that came together and fought, and in particular, the Stele mentions one of the kings is King Ahab. And King Ahab, according to the Assyrian records, and if you remember your Old Testament, Ahab was the one who married Jezebel. Jezebel, of course, was the non-Jewish queen that everyone hated because she was terrible and she worshiped other gods and she didn't worship Yahweh correctly. So Ahab contributed to this 12-nation coalition, 2,000 chariots and 10,000 troops. The most chariots of anybody else listed, and the same number as much as the Egyptians, who contributed also 10,000 troops. So what this tells you is that Israel was kind of they were a significant player. They weren't a nobody. They had a pretty good military. They had a pretty strong military. They were well established. You don't end up with 12,000 or 2,000 chariots and 10,000 soldiers just being a small little collection of farming. This shows that the Northern Kingdom was pretty well developed. They had pretty strong control over all of their territories. They were able to bring in enough money through trade and through mining and whatever other activities they had going on to be able to fund these kind of building campaigns in this type of military. So, interesting little side note, kind of the precursor. It also laid the groundwork for the Northern Kingdom being at odds with the Assyrian Empire. So this is really before the big push of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the big push, which came about 100 years later. But it sets them up as they're not playing ball. They're not playing nice with the Assyrians. They're standing up to the Assyrians. So now we fast forward about 100 years, and we get to the date of 738 BC. And by this time, the Assyrian Empire has grown, and Israel is now a vassal state. So the way these ancient empires would work is they would take over a nation, they would leave the king in place, as long as you were agreeable, and then you pay your taxes or your tribute to the empire. And you did what the emperor told you to do. And so you were kind of like you had some autonomy, but you weren't completely free to do what you wanted. You had to follow the rules of the empire. But that was a better deal than the other option, which was get destroyed and obliterated. So yeah, those were kind of your two options: either play ball, or we're going to kill you. So in 738, according to 2 Kings here, our biblical text, King Menahem of Israel was paying tribute to Assyria as a vassal state. And the text says, King Paul, and this is another, when you read the Old Testament, it's really hard because everybody has like 5 different names. Everybody's got a different name. Even Abraham started out as Abram, and Jacob started out, and everybody's changing their names all the time. So you have to, if you're interested in a PhD in biblical studies, you can go and learn all the different names and how they figured out that the different names applied to different people. But anyway, King Paul is Tiglath-Pileser. Remember we talked about him. He was the first major emperor of the Neo-Assyrians. He came against the land, and Menahem gave him 1,000 talents of silver so that he might help him confirm his hold on the royal power. In the Northern Kingdom, there was a lot of turmoil. Kings were constantly getting murdered and overthrown and usurped in the Northern Empire. They had multiple dynasties because in the South, it was pretty steady. It was always kind of a Davidic dynasty. It stayed within the family. But in the Northern Kingdom, you always had these players trying to take over. So Menahem was trying to make sure that everybody stayed, that he stayed in power. So he cut this deal with Assyria. He paid them 50 shekels of silver and gave it to the king. And the king of Assyria turned his army back and didn't stay in the land. So Israel at this point says, you know what? We're just going to play nice. We'll pay you your tribute. Everything should be fine. Don't kill us. And that worked for about 5 years until 733, when a bunch of vassal states, King Menahem died. He was replaced or assassinated. I can't remember which one. But anyway, he was gone. And the new king came in, and they formed an alliance against the Assyrians with the Egyptians, with Damascus, which is north in just regular Syria. And they came to the king of Judah, and they said, hey, we're standing up against Assyria. We need you to help us. And the king of Judah, King Ahaz, he was also a vassal state. He was like, no way. They're going to come and obliterate me. I'm not going to do that. And so then this coalition of troops went against Judah. They moved in and started a military campaign to wipe out Judah. So King Ahaz, being the smart vassal king that he is, sent a messenger to Assyria and said, hey, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Israel who's attacking me. This is in 2 Kings 16. And Ahaz also took silver and gold from the temple and the treasures of the king, and he sent a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria was more than happy to come in and aid his vassal state, because not only could he put down this rebellion, but he also, remember, everybody moved through Israel and through Canaan. He could control the trade routes. So any traders who were coming through then he would have control over them. He could stop access if people weren't paying nice. He could charge them tariffs and fees and tolls. So he was very happy to do that. So he came down to defend, to help out Judah. He quelled the military assault. He came in and he defeated the northern kingdom's armies and pretty much wiped out the northern part of the northern kingdom. And so if you look at this map, if you take a look at, this is a zoom in now on Israel. Here's the southern kingdom. Here's Jerusalem here. And then this is the northern kingdom. And up at the very north is the town of Dan. Here's the fortress city of Hatzor. We hear about Hatzor a lot especially in like Judges and Joshua. This is the Galilee. This is where Jesus is from. Here's Capernaum. So the Assyrians came in and they pretty much took control of this northern part of the country, but they didn't wipe out Samaria completely.
Well, they really didn't have any other choice because they had nowhere else to go.
That's right. You're kind of stuck there in the middle. If you're in the land of Israel, you either go to the Egyptians or you got to go north to the Assyrians.
No access to trade
Right.
routes like the Mediterranean, or they lived in
Right.
rubble.
Right. So King Pekah was the king who was leading the assault, or leading the uprising against the Assyrians. He got overthrown and assassinated by Hoshea. And Hoshea said, he went to the king of Assyria and said, hey, I'll be your vassal king and I'll play nice with you. So the Annals of Tiglath-Pileser, this is a pagan source, says they overthrew their king and I placed Hoshea as king over them. And in 2 Kings, they say the same thing. Then Hoshea made a conspiracy against Pekah, attacked him and killed him, and he reigned in place of him. So you're getting good confirmation between what's in the Bible and what the pagan sources are saying. So it's scholars love it when these things kind of line up. It's like, oh, that's perfect. Two independent sources saying the same thing. So life should have been good, but as is always the case in these kings and vassal kings get too big for their britches, and pretty soon Hoshea was plotting with Egypt to try to throw off the Assyrians, saying, we can take these guys out. We can take them out, and why don't you join up with me? By this time, Tiglath-Pileser had died. His son Shalmaneser had taken over, and he came in and he was like, enough of this BS. And he laid siege to Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. And I think it's important that you remember that because, of course, all good New Testament scholars know about Samaria and Samaritans, right? Jesus talked about the Samaritans. They were the hated ones. They were from the northern kingdom. Samaria was the city, the capital of the northern kingdom. But Hoshea, so in the biblical text it says, Hoshea reigned over Samaria for 9 years, but he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the king of Assyria came up against him, and he found the king of Assyria, Hoshea tried to pay him some tribute, but the king of Assyria found treachery in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to the king of Egypt and offered no tribute to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore, the king of Assyria confined him and imprisoned him. So in other words, Hoshea decides, I can take on these Assyrians and I can win if I get the help with the Egyptians. He quit paying his annual tribute, and Shalmaneser comes in, invades, and wipes out the Assyrians. The king of Assyria invaded the land, all the land, and came to Samaria, and for 3 years besieged it. And you remember, these cities were not like our modern cities. They're all walled cities, so they would wall up. It's all this ancient medieval warfare where they would wall up in the city, and the attacking armies would surround them and cut off their food, cut off their supplies, and just for years and years, attack, daily attacks. It wasn't like this one quick battle and it's over. They would just, it's a war of attrition. Very brutal. So eventually, the king took out King Hoshea. He leveled Samaria. He took all of the people in Samaria and dispersed them all out into the world. 2 Kings 17:7, 1 through 7. And the closing line of this passage, this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God. That's the biblical spin. These bad things happened because the people of Israel and their king had sinned against the Lord. There's a political reason. They quit paying their taxes and they fomented rebellion. Which one is it? The facts are the same, but the reasoning for the facts differs depending on your perspective. All of that stuff that I just told you, amazingly, is confirmed in this beautiful Assyrian cuneiform tablet discovered at the end of the 19th century. And it goes through, and it basically, from the Assyrian standpoint, recounts all of the same thing. The king quit paying tribute. I came in and attacked the city. I wiped the city out. I took 27,290 captives. Those captives were probably men, but it was also livestock and women and children. And he took them captive and hauled them out of where they lived, and they got dispersed into the Assyrian Empire. So again, the basic facts is really good correlation. Really cool. But the Assyrians weren't finished. They had taken out the northern kingdom, but there was still the problem with the southern kingdom. Now, the southern kingdom, you remember Ahaz, he was a vassal king, and he was like, hey, I'm cool with all this. I'm good with you guys. Well, Ahaz died at the ripe old age of 51, and his son Hezekiah took over. Hezekiah was not so keen on being a vassal state. He wanted to be a king like the kings of old, David and Solomon. And he was also a reformer. He bought in to the religious reform because what was happening in Judea is they were looking at the northern kingdom. And in the northern kingdom, there was the big economic argument between the two kingdoms was in the north, you could go to synagogues or the religious sites either in Dan. Remember, Dan was way up in the top in the north, or there was another religious site in the south, Bethel. And those two sites, you could go and worship Yahweh, and that was fine. That was accepted by the northern kingdom. In the south, though, the south wanted everybody to come to the temple in Jerusalem, because that's where Yahweh lived. That's the true home of God. And there's economic reasons. When you go on a pilgrimage and you go to one of these places, you have to stay for a while, you have to eat out, you have to go to the motel and get a room, you have to buy some animals for your sacrifice. There's a big economic boon to having a religious site. And so there's a difference in economy if you're going to these sites up in Dan and Bethel versus coming down to Jerusalem. Now the northern kingdom's gone, and the southern perspective is, see, we told you, you should have come to Jerusalem. You didn't do what God told you to do. God said, come to Jerusalem, and you didn't do it. You kept going to Dan, you kept going to Bethel, and you kept making all these sacrifices in the wrong places and in the wrong way, and you did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So Hezekiah he bought into that mindset that has been brewing for a while, and he became a reformer. He solidified the worship in Jerusalem temple. There were still, even in Judea, little sites around the countryside where people could go and worship. He shut all of those down. He also eliminated the worship of foreign gods. If you remember back then, there was, if you remember the story of Elijah doing battle with the priests of Baal or Baal, and the Canaanite gods. There were other gods that the ancient Israelites acknowledged. Ancient Israelites were not monotheists. They believed in other gods. What they believed, though, is that they belonged to Yahweh. Yahweh was their God. So the Canaanites had their gods, the Egyptians have their gods, the Assyrians have their gods. They need to go over and do their thing, and they should worship their gods the way their gods tell them to worship. Your God, you, O Israel, belong to Yahweh, and this is who you should worship. So don't try to hedge your bets by worshiping both Yahweh and these old Canaanite gods. You got to pick one. We belong to Yahweh. We're going to worship Yahweh. You got to leave these other gods to the side. So Hezekiah really kind of pushed down on that. So he was a religious reformer. As a result, the Bible, the biblical text, when you read 2 Kings, Hezekiah was a king after God's heart, similar to David. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord. But Hezekiah also started plotting with against Assyria with Egypt and these other regional states. Now, Egypt's further down, and if you remember that map, you come through Israel and there's a stretch of desert. It's not a long stretch, but it's maybe 100 miles that you have to cross before you get to Egypt. So they kind of had this like little natural defense border that they could use. So I think of Egypt as they're like always stirring the pot. They're the ones in the play yard who are like, hey, go hit that kid. Hey, go hit that kid. You're not going to get in trouble. Go ahead and do it. So they're like always stirring people up, trying to get people to do stuff. And they've got their own little defense mechanism. They can just pull back to behind the desert and the Nile and stay there with the Nile River where they have plenty of food and plenty of water. So in 701 BCE, Sennacherib, who now, remember, we're kind of working our way through those names from the first one, and he's the last name. He's one of the last Assyrian emperors mentioned in the Bible. He's like, enough of this. I'm sick and tired. You guys have been a pain in the butt for over 100 years. My father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather had to deal with you. I'm going to come in and finish the job. So he comes into the Levant, and again, all of this is captured on this beautiful standing stone, again, in the British Museum. So we all need to take a class trip to London and go to the British Museum. That recounts all of these events from the Assyrian point of view. which is amazing. So Hezekiah, he kind of got word that the Assyrians were coming. And he's like, this is not good. Because when they came before, he goes, we're not ready. And when they came before, they took out Israel. And I don't have my alliance shorn up with Egypt. So he said, I got to start making preparations to defend Jerusalem. And this included building and reinforcing the city walls. But he also, one of the biggest problems with sieges is if you didn't have a source of fresh water, you didn't have water. And most of the cities were built up on the hills, kind of natural defenses, and then they'd have to go down to where the water was, either in the lake or the spring or the river. So this was a problem for Hezekiah. He's like, we can't survive if we don't have water. So what he did is he sent a message to Sennacherib and said, hey, I'm not really trying to foment rebellion, and here's a tribute. Here's some money, I'll pay you. Trying to stave off the invasion. Maybe he thought it would work. Maybe he was just trying to give himself more times to get ready. But as the biblical text tells us, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib of Assyria marched against the fortified towns of Judah and seized them. And Hezekiah sent this message to the king of Assyria, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I shall bear whatever you impose on me. So the king of Assyria imposed a payment of 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all of the silver that was on hand in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the palace. He even cut off the doors of the temple, which had been overlain with gold, and shipped the doors of the temple off to Sennacherib in an effort to placate him. So he paid a lot of money to try to get Sennacherib to back off. But Sennacherib wouldn't. And the biblical text wraps up and mentions this one little spot. But to me, this is one of the most amazing archaeological things you can see in Israel if you go. The other events of Hezekiah's reigns and all his exploits and how he made the pool and the conduit and brought water into the city are recorded in the annals of the kings of Judah. And this is a picture today of Hezekiah's tunnel. Hezekiah, what they did is Hezekiah said, I've got to get fresh water. There's a spring just upstream, and he had his people excavate a tunnel to bring water into the city. And it was an underground tunnel, so it couldn't be attacked by the Assyrians, and they would have fresh water source. Just a little cutaway of kind of how the tunnel went. I find this amazing. I'm an engineer, and I do a lot of water projects. We take for granted when we turn on the tap all the effort that goes in to make sure the water that comes out of the tap is clean and treated and drinkable. In the tunnel, they found this inscription plate, and what this inscription plate says is it's a history. It dates back to Hezekiah. And it says, not all of it's intact, but most of it is. And it says, when the tunnel was driven through, this is the way in which it was cut through. The men were working towards each other from other ends, and they were hacking through the limestone. And while they were still 3 cubits left to be cut, they could hear the voices of the other crews working, for there was an overlap in the rock. And when the tunnel was driven through, the quarrymen hewed the rock, each man towards each other, and axe fell against axe. So they're hacking through, and there's that moment where the two axes collide. It would make a great movie, a great scene in a movie. And the water flowed from the spring towards the reservoir for 1,200 cubits. A beautiful example of being able to go in today and see things that happened 2,700 years ago, for which we have descriptions in the Bible, descriptions in pagan sources. It's amazing. So if you go to Israel and you go to Jerusalem, you should at least go check it out. I haven't been there That would be fun. I would love to do it. I'd love to see it. All right, so now Hezekiah is getting ready for the siege because he knows the Assyrians are coming. So, and the Assyrians kind of surround the city. And if you remember from all the stories in the Bible, everybody goes up to Jerusalem, right? Everybody always says, oh, let's go up to Jerusalem. That's because Jerusalem is up on the top of like a big hill. And so wherever you are, north, south, east, west, you have to go up to get to Jerusalem. It's got a natural fortification, which makes sense why David wanted it as the capital city for Judea. We'll talk more about that. There used to be a different capital in Judea, and he moved it to Jerusalem, which I think was a much more, if you just think militarily, was a much more defensible location. But the king of Assyria sent his generals with a large force to King Hezekiah, and they said, "Thus says the great king, the king of Assyria." This is all from the Bible, but I love this text. There's a thing in the Bible that says, or a method in scholarship that says, if there's something in a text that undercuts the main argument of the text, it's got a higher probability to be true. In other words, why would someone, if you're trying to make the message, if you're writing the Bible and you're trying to make it that God's defending you, why would you put something into the text that undercuts your argument? And this whole passage undercuts that argument, because the Assyrians come in and they say, "What makes you so confident? You must think that mere talk is counsel and valor for war. Look on whom you're relying. You've rebelled, and who you've rebelled against me. You rely on all things on Egypt, that splintered reed on a staff. And if you tell me that you are relying on the Lord your God, he is the very one whose shrines and altars Hezekiah did away with." So the Assyrians are taking what they know as Judean history. They're like, your king wiped out all the shrines. Your God's not going to be with you. Because the Assyrian gods, of course, it was fairly common practice to worship, have multiple shrines and multiple places to worship. So they're like, your king destroyed all your shrines. You think your God's going to protect you? You guys are crazy. So the Assyrians are taunting them, and then they say, "Come now, make this wager with my master, the king of Assyria. I'll give you 2,000 horses. I'll give you the horses. And if you can produce the riders to mount them." Basically saying, even if I gave you the horses, even if I gave you the weapons to fight, you don't even have the people to fight. You guys are going to get destroyed. I love this whole passage. It's great. And so you think, and then he says, "And do you think I have marched against this land to destroy it without the Lord? The Lord himself told me, go up against that land and destroy it." So the Assyrian king was basically saying, your God is pissed off. And he came to me and told me to come up against this land because you guys aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing. That's the Assyrian point of view. So the siege lasted for years, 2-3 years, and they couldn't get in. They just couldn't capture the city. And at the end, in 2 Kings 19, there's this passage that documents the end of the siege from the Bible's point of view. That night, an angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 soldiers in the Assyrian camp. And the following morning, they were all dead corpses. Wow. Miraculous. So King Sennacherib of Assyria broke camp and retreated, and he went back and stayed in Nineveh. And while he was worshiping in the temple of his God, his sons, 2 names I can't pronounce, struck him down with the sword, and they fled the land, and his son succeeded him as king. This paragraph is all true. The Assyrians broke off the siege. They never captured the city of Jerusalem. They never captured Judah. Sennacherib went back to Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, or one of the capitals, and his sons killed him. All of that's documented in Assyrian records. This part is a bit speculative. What the Assyrians say, and this is in that big stele that I showed you, the Assyrians say, as for Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, walled forts. I used mines, I used soldiers, I used excavations. I drove out of them 200,000 people. Hezekiah I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, his royal residence, like a bird in a cage. So, and at the end, Sennacherib says, I reduced his country, but I still increased the tribute. So, what happened? Did the angel of the Lord come and wipe them out? What we know is the siege got broken off. That's my next slide. Both sides are spinning the actual facts of what happened. Sennacherib doesn't want to say he lost or he couldn't capture this little puny king from a little small vassal state. The Judahites were like, our God has saved us. Our God wiped them out because they're gone. We had this siege for 3 years and they're gone. If you kind of read between the lines, the discussion in the biblical text about getting wiped out by an angel of death sounds a lot like disease, you know? Disease was very common in ancient warfare. They didn't have clean water, they didn't have good sanitation, and commonly armies could get wiped out by disease. Maybe there was a disease, maybe other issues were arising. You know, the Babylonian threat was starting to grow back in the southeast, back in on the southern border of Assyria. Maybe they just like, I'm spending too much time on this little dinky king and I got more important things to take care of. Maybe they went back. I don't know. I don't know exactly what happened. The record is not clear as to why. Neither side wanted to admit defeat, and both sides tried to claim victory. But at the end of the day, Jerusalem survived, and that survival added fuel to the fire, or fuel to their conviction that their God was protecting them, and that they were doing the right things, that Hezekiah was doing the right thing to lead them in their worship of God.
Was the water the key to that success?
Oh, I am sure it was probably a key. It would allow them to hold out for a long period of time. So those convictions that Yahweh would never let Israel or the house of David fall, that became cemented in the mindset. But what we do know is that Hezekiah started paying tribute again. That's documented in later Assyrian records. So all the big hullabaloo, but when all the dust settled, they were still in a semi-autonomous state, but they were still paying tribute to the Assyrians, as did the future king. But in the minds of Judah, they had been saved by their God, and they were basically invincible. But what we'll see next week is the Babylonians had a different idea. So, went too fast. So that's it. That was fast. That was a lot of stuff. Do you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts?
It's also complicated.
It's very complicated. If you think that this was too in the weeds, I can try to. I told Terry I was struggling. Okay, great. Because I was struggling. I didn't want to just gloss over it. But let me tell you, we could be here for like 4 hours talking about it if I really went into all the stuff that I was reading over the past week.
We might have to review that.
So if this is good, I'll kind of try to keep it at this level a bit.
Just don't ask us to read the stone.
You don't have to read the stones. You don't have to read the stones. All right, that sounds great. I will look forward to seeing you all next week. I will send you all an email with the link once everything's posted to YouTube. And I hope you guys have a great week.
Thank you, Scott.
Goes Jaguars.